and now for something completely different, but not quite so. Because the part of the program that we are enjoying, and I'm pretty sure we will indeed enjoy it very much now, is delivered by a very fellow and dear friend of mine, Professor Nuno Maulide, the chair in organic chemistry at the University of Vienna, who happens to be a multi-talent as well. Not only he speaks, how many? 6 languages? But he's also a concerto pianist. And I mean, I also learned 12 years of playing the piano, but not at least any level that Nuno is delivering. And what Nuno has a natural talent to do is essentially connecting things. And what he connects today is his passion for music with his passion for science and chemistry in particular. And we're gonna enjoy a 30-minute program by Nuno, bringing these two worlds together, and what better place to do that than here in Vienna, the capital of music, and hopefully in the future, the capital of green chemistry. Nuno.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much also for the very kind introduction, Marco. It was really a pleasure to be here today at the kickoff moment of something that actually began a few years ago, if I recall correctly, around a lunch table, right? Where you actually challenged me with the idea of, do you think it would be possible to bring multiple universities in Vienna together for a teaching training initiative? And I, with my few years of living in Austria, said, no way. And then look at what happened and look at how far the whole thing has come. Rosi joined us, Thomas Rosenau, and then the whole team grew progressively as we eventually made this a reality. And it's really a pleasure to be able to tell you today about something very different, namely, or maybe not, how green chemistry might be seen as an art, how chemistry and music, how art and science might indeed have something to do with one another. The picture you have in front of you is a painting by an American artist called Clary Meserve called Einstein's Art and Science. And I think it's a very good prelude to what I would like to tell you about today, namely about these two areas of human endeavor that are typically seen as very, very different from one another. And it's normal that they would be seen as different from one another, because when you think about art and science, you think about two different pairs of shoes. Art, after all, driven by emotions, feelings, by abstract aspects of human nature, whereas science is typically driven by facts and hard data. We are past the era of alternative facts. That was the other administration in the US. We are now very well aware that facts have to be solid and have to be really based on data. So how can these two worlds come together? If you think further about who actually performs art and who carries out science, the two couldn't be more different, right? Scientists are usually these very eccentric, extroverted personalities, whereas, artists, whereas scientists, I put there technical introverts. It's kind of a euphemism for the word geeks or nerds. This is what the public usually thinks of when they think of a chemist. They think of someone in a lab coat, maybe with hair like Professor Polyakov, and inside a lab, not really interacting with others. And yet I would like to convince you through this short presentation that actually there is something very beautiful at the intersection between art and science, mainly because both focus on things which are so fundamental to who we are as a species. Both focus on questions as essential as what is truth? How does the universe work? How does our world work? How does our body function? And how can we use this knowledge to bring society forward? It's actually quite obvious that both art and science, to be practiced at the highest level of achievement, must be extremely open-minded. Both must be prepared to embrace the unknown. And so, in a sense, although they use different tools and they have a different language, and perhaps even they have different methods to carry out their activity, art and science, ladies and gentlemen, are actually much more together than they are apart from one another. And let me show you an example, because I believe that art and science do nothing else than connect our abstract world with our concrete world. They just do it in different directions. This is my own personal take. I believe that art takes abstract feelings and emotions and makes concrete works of art out of them. A poem, a piece of music, a sculpture. And science does precisely the opposite. Science takes the hard facts of everyday life, the fact that the sky is blue, the fact that water is liquid, and elaborates abstract theories to explain and rationalize those facts. The one you have here is something that to all of us, chemists or non-chemists, evokes an aroma, a certain smell, a certain taste. And we chemists, what we then do is we create an abstraction, the chemical structure of the major component of orange oil. And so, in talking about green chemistry, I think it's clear that green chemistry is a very different way of looking into that discipline that we have all been looking at and studying for the last years, because clearly all of us, no matter whether we are analytical, organic, food, or inorganic chemists, must understand that chemistry is actually a unique discipline in how it interacts with the world that surrounds us and shapes that very world. Every day, we are able to put something out in this planet that was never before on the face of this earth. And this should be seen as a very, very creative endeavor. I already alluded to the fact that it also requires a lot of different disciplines coming together. This has been said multiple times, and I think the presentation of the curriculum also shows that this is not a synthetic chemistry endeavor, this is not a theoretical chemistry endeavor, it's an endeavor of all of chemistry looking holistically at this discipline, and it brings together what I like to call the value of collaborative work, which is essentially the excuse for our first musical moment today, namely for an etude by Chopin in A-flat major. And like all music by Chopin, this piece has a melody and an accompanying part. Yet the melody is probably one of the most boring melodies you have ever heard. Full of repeated notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Nothing to write home about. And let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, the accompanying part is even worse. It looks like a very old and rusty jukebox. But when you put both of them together and you add a little touch of the right pedal on the piano, it almost feels like water is flowing out of a piano. Beautiful how when you put everything together, you no longer realize that the melody had all these repeated notes. You no longer realize that the accompanying part was this rusty jukebox. The whole was truly more than the sum of its parts. Just like in every collaborative project that you and I do as chemists, just like we have just achieved in combining a master's program which is truly more than the independent contributions of each of the three houses. I hope you enjoy this piece. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. We continue along this theme by trying to look at people that may have been doing both things together already quite a few years ago. And one example that is perhaps not immediately apparent, that I like to quote, is that of Edward Elgar, a well-known and celebrated composer in the United Kingdom, but also quite the accomplished amateur chemist. Actually, Elgar was very fond of dabbling with the chemistry of white phosphorus. I think this might suggest something to you. Indeed, neighbors of the Elgar family routinely wrote letters and complaints about the explosions that typically happened in the backyard of the Elgar family. Edward Elgar also pioneered an apparatus for the extraction and purification of H2S, which is still currently used. Actually, it was patented, and it's still called the Elgar apparatus for purifying H2S. Look it up, you might be surprised. Of course, the classical example when we think about music and chemistry has to be Alexander Borodin, a very celebrated composer. Lots of beautiful music by Borodin keeps being presented in Musikverein and Konzerthaus and all over the planet. But of course, Borodin to us, chemists, a very fond name, mainly because of two key contributions. The one on the top, I teach every winter semester in my lecture Organische Chemie 2, the Borodin-Hunziker decarboxylative halogenation of carboxylic acid. It's a beautiful transformation. And the second one, the precursor of what is now known as the aldol reaction, among other things, rewarded with a Nobel Prize in Chemistry 2021. But ladies and gentlemen, let me try to convince you that there is another person who we should also look at as a scientist and a musician. And that is Johann Sebastian Bach, my favorite composer, and through the last 25 years of his career, responsible for all the church music composed and performed in the city of Leipzig. That was actually his job. And Johann Sebastian Bach had this very difficult task of every week coming up with 4 hours of music to accompany the liturgic service in the church for Sunday. And that was no mean feat. 4 hours of music is a lot of music to compose. Ask Lady Gaga how she would do if she had to compose 4 hours of music every week. New music. And so Bach relied typically on pieces and snippets of music that were already existing. Like this one for the choral Jesus bleibet meine Freude. Jesus bleibet meine Freude is actually a very traditional melody that every person in the 1700s in the German-speaking world was able to sing by heart. You have to really imagine everybody was able to spontaneously stand up and sing this melody by heart without failing a heartbeat. Bach thought, what can I do with this melody? I can certainly compose a harmony around it. Would have been enough for many, many composers to just go on and use this kind of harmonization. Bach felt that some of these notes were a little bit too long and didn't really have much going on in between. And he imagined, what about if I were able to compose a second melody that would somehow fill these gaps and have a little bit more action? And you know what this melody to fill the gaps was? And the two of them work remarkably well together. What I found most remarkable and somewhat ironic is that the melody that everybody was able to jump up and sing on a heartbeat is now completely unknown to us. The melody that Bach composed as filling music is something that is very familiar to all of us. We even find it sometimes on mobile phone ringtones. And that is also an iron law of science. Nobody can tell what will be famous in 20 or 30 years. Nobody can tell whether the hot topics and hot trends of today will hold on in a couple of decades. I always like to quote as one of my favorite examples, this reaction here, it's a little bit small, but suffice to say, it combines an organomercury reagent, certainly something which green chemistry does not want to touch, in the amount of stoichiometric palladium as a promoter, not only expensive, but certainly not sustainable. A reaction published in JAX in 1968, which certainly would today classify as a very exotic endeavor. Who on earth wants to ever touch this type of chemistry? And yet, 40 years later, this was one of the halves of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry 2010 for the development of palladium-catalyzed cross-couplings. Nobody, neither you nor me, can tell what will be hot in 20 or 30 years and whether what we think is now so great will really be so in a few years. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Bach is also, in my opinion, someone who has gone through in his life something that I very much consider akin to what we academics also go through in our lives. Because I just told you that he occupied this very important position in Leipzig in the last 25 years of his life. And you have to wonder, as an academic, Professor Mihovilovic is professor at the TU, I am professor at the Uni Wien, how do we actually get to becoming professors, right? Because before us, there was someone in the same position. So something has to happen to those persons. Either they retire or... And actually, that is what happened to the predecessor of Johann Sebastian Bach in Leipzig. Johann Kuhnau, he passed away in 1722. So the council of the city of Leipzig did exactly what the rectorat of the TU Wien would do. They made an Ausschreibung, and they invited famous musicians that wanted to occupy this position to apply. A lot of musicians applied. They selected the applications. Probably they had a kind of a Berufungskommission, something like that. I don't know if they had also Mittelbau and Studenten represented. We have to dig deeper into the archives to find that. In any case, what we do know is that he invited the best candidates for an interview in Leipzig, and that then they selected from those a short list, top 3, number 1, number 2, number 3. And they made a Besetzungsvorschlag to the city of Leipzig. And you might be surprised when I show you what that Besetzungsvorschlag looked like. Might not be exactly what you expected. The person who is number 1, the desired candidate, Georg Philipp Telemann, was by far the most famous and most respected musician in the Baroque period in the German-speaking world. He was the one that everybody wanted to have. He already had a position as Kapellmeister in Hamburg, so he did what some of us also do sometimes. He went to Hamburg and he said, these people from Leipzig would like to have me as their cantor. What can you do? And the city of Hamburg raised his salary by 20%, and so Georg Philipp Telemann stayed in Hamburg and said bye-bye to Leipzig. Okay, Leipzig was fine because they had a list. They went down the list, they went to number 2. Number 2 is an even more cryptic name. You might never have heard of Christoph Graupner. If you have, my applause, because I have not heard of him before researching this. If you go on Wikipedia, Christoph Graupner has a Wikipedia page where it says a German composer whose most famous moment was coming number 2 in the competition against Johann Sebastian Bach. Graupner already had himself a job in Darmstadt, and so he went to Darmstadt and he said, Darmstadt, these people in Leipzig would like to recruit me, what can you do? And this is all in the archives. Darmstadt offered him a bigger house. And so he decided to stay in Darmstadt and he rejected the offer from Leipzig. And iron law also of Berufungskommissionen is, if you make a 3-person shortlist, a Dreiervorschlag, in position number 3, you always put someone who has no choice but to accept. That was Johann Sebastian Bach, who really had no other choice but to move to Leipzig because he had no other position. He had just left his previous position in a conflict, so he actually was kind of unemployed. And between IMS and Leipzig, I think he chose very smartly to go to Leipzig and become the musician that we now all celebrate as one of the best accomplished examples of Western music over the last 500 years. And what I find very interesting is when you read the letter with which Christoph Graupner, all this is in the archives of the city of Leipzig. I invite you to go there and to read, because it's really very vivid, and the way people write these letters is very special. Christoph Graupner wrote a very long letter saying to Leipzig why he was not able, unfortunately, to take this call. And among the things he wrote in this letter is a very beautiful statement that he makes about his contemporary, Bach. And he writes, Bach is a musician just as strong on the organ as he is expert in church works and capella pieces, and he will honestly and properly perform the functions entrusted to him. Kind of telling him, don't be sad that you only get number 3. You will do fine with him. He's going to do okay. And I think we can look back at this and think of a letter written by someone who history did not preserve, writing about someone who we now believe to be one of the highest pinnacles of Western music. And this also is a very nice way to bring us to the last point, because chemists and scientists do not exist in a vacuum, right? Nobody woke up one day and decided, let's invent green chemistry. All these things are incremental improvements. Every time we make a discovery, we are standing on the shoulders of giants. We are relying on what others have done. And while in chemistry and in science, that is something that is well accepted, because we all cite each other's works, we should always put references to literature that precedes us and which supports the things we are trying to develop. So is also sometimes in music. Musicians, as you've just seen, are very well aware of each other's work. Graupner was very well aware of who Bach was, and vice versa. And an example that I would like to share with you to finish today's presentation is the so-called Gollywog's Cakewalk, written by Claude Debussy, a French musician, from a collection of compositions called the Children's Corner. I do have to explain you what the Children's Corner is. A Children's Corner is a collection of 6 pieces, which were essentially the pieces that Claude Debussy wrote every year as a birthday present to his daughter. Every year he wrote a different composition, specifically dedicated to his daughter, and at the end of the 6th birthday he decided, now it's enough, you've had enough compositions, and collected all of them and published them as the Children's Corner. Gollywog's Cakewalk is a beautiful example of Debussy's genius, because it's a piece written, as you might see from the name, Cakewalk, in very classical American Joplin Gershwin style, although Debussy himself never in his entire life put one foot in the United States of America. Yet, the music he wrote is more American than some of the Gershwin compositions that you know. Very American in style, and also very beautiful, something that he does in there, which is a direct citation of one of his contemporaries. So Debussy, all these composers do not exist in a vacuum. They were very well aware of what was going on around them in Europe, in the world at that time, and Debussy was very well aware, around 1911, of something that had just appeared and was making the rounds, was like the CH activation of that time. Everybody was talking about Tristan and Isolde, the opera by Richard Wagner, because it was being heralded as a magical turning point, a milestone in the history of music. The first notes of Tristan and Isolde and the first chord in that opera are today, in history of music, taught as the first moment in the history of music where music went from being tonal to atonal. Let me give you an example. Tonal music is the Lady Gaga, is the pop music of every day. Is the music where you know where you are going. You always know where you are at home, no matter how many steps you've taken to go home. Atonal music is music where you never feel at home, you never feel safe. It's just a combination of moments of tension that never really resolve. And the opening of Tristan and Isolde, I think you will recognize, is pure tension with no indication of where you want to go. These are the first notes of that opera. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is a moment of history, because this chord is just dissonance, it's just tension, but it does not tell you where you are. It's the next notes that Wagner writes that kind of define where home should be. But at this moment here, you really don't know where you are. It's not neither meat nor fish. It's the beginning of atonal music. And what is particularly nice is that Gollywog's Cakewalk has this first part that is very lively. In the middle, it has a second part. And on that second part, Debussy directly quotes this opening in, how to say, not necessarily very respectful manner. But I let you listen and decide what you make of it. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Nuno, thank you very much for this. I think it's really important to inspire us at all different levels. And we got inspiration from the scientific level, and now we got inspiration from the emotional level. And I think there's not much to say anymore to close this, this opening ceremony, but to try to pull now the ball back into your turf and say this all should steer our creativity. Let's use our creativity in the field of green chemistry. Thank you for being with us here. I hope you all took some inspiration from today, and I'm very much looking forward to the next steps here in this Green Chemistry Initiative. Thanks also very much to the Ministry of Climate Action to support this activity so boldly, and thanks for everybody involved to contributing with their own energy and enthusiasm.